Greetings lovely folks, welcome back to another video. Today I would like to introduce you to this adorable little Schleich Donkey who I will be painting today. Now she came in a job lot with a lot of other models and I found her at the bottom of a box a few weeks ago and realised that she was in dire need of a new life. She came with a bit of disrepair. This ear here was missing halfway down, which I have resculpted. I will insert a picture here of what she looked like before I put the primer on. And a few other marks which I've done my best to sand down and blend back into the rest of her coat. So I'm thinking she's going to be some sort of paint or pinto, and I'm thinking she would look very nice in a sort of dun colour, so let's see where it goes. I'm going to be using acrylics for her base coat today. Normally I would go in with pastels over a primer base, but due to the fact that this model has a very textured coat, if I start by putting pastels straight on top of this, it's going to sit on top of her hair details and not go into the grooves between, which is going to make her look very grainy, and that's not a look that I want. So I'm going to start out by using a dilute mixture of these colours to give her a solid base coat that I will then go in on top of with pastels to create some colour gradients within her coat. As always when using acrylics, I dilute my paint mixture with water. Not too much, because if the ratio of water to paint is too great, the paint is at risk of separating or flaking at a later date, but just enough to make the paint application thinner and smoother. On a model like this with a rough surface, this makes the paint much easier to apply and get into all the cracks and crevices in the coat to build a solid layer. If you want to dilute paint further, I strongly suggest investing in some acrylic paint thinner, which you can find online at many art stores. Her first layer is done. I've gone with this nice sort of buttery colour. And now I'm going to mix a slightly darker shade of colour and work it into this coat while this one is still wet so that it will blend nicely. Now what I'm doing here is essentially using dry brushing, but while the paint is wet, so I'm only laying this colour really on the topmost layer of the model, so over where the hair detailing is raised, rather than working it into all the cracks between as well. And I'm only going to really be doing this colour over the top of the model and on the lower legs, so that it brings some dimension and depth into the coat. There are many ways to blend paint, many of which depend on the type of paint being used. Acrylics are common for model horse customizing, which can be dry brushed or blended wet into wet. Airbrushing is also a popular way to put down a soft base coat. I've never used an airbrush personally, but I see other artists getting beautiful results with it. Oil paints are also used by some briar and resin artists, as they blend and dry brush very well. I personally use wet into wet acrylics on my Schleichs and Collectes, a technique I also use on manes and tails on all models, as I like the streaky colour gradients it creates in long hair. I was going to mix one of these in to create a darker gradient, but unfortunately both of them have dried up in the tubes, so I can't. So I'm going to continue using the yellow ochre, and I'm just going to work going darker with this until I'm happy with the acrylic layer, and then I'm going to use some pastels to give like a final blend to the coat instead. It's going to keep mixing increasingly darker shades using white and yellow ochre, and blend them wet and wet with each other so that they create a very smooth transition between colours on the model. Here I'm using the pale cream colour again to define the donkey's undercoat. Donkeys tend to have a visible colour difference between their belly and back, typically, though not always, being darker on top and lighter underneath. I'm again blending it into the wet paint for a soft effect. Going back and forth between lights and darks is how I create subtleties in the coat colour. Here I've gone back in with a darker sand tone to bring out more contrast. Moving on to pastels, I started with a dark brown on the lower legs. Then I put a layer of the same colour on the neck and shoulders, making sure to push the pigment into the coat texture. This is one of my blending techniques for using acrylics and pastels together, where I take a very small amount of dilute white paint and apply it over the surface of unsealed pastels, mixing with the pastel to create a more muted version of the pastel colour. This also helps blend the edges of the pastels into a rough surface and conveniently locks in the pastel colours so I don't have to seal it before continuing to paint. I'm using this technique over the neck and shoulders where I lay down the dark brown pastel, going back and forth for a while between pastel and white acrylic until I reach a colour saturation that I'm happy with. gave her nose and the inside of her ears a base coat of white, and then moved on to painting her eyebrows white as well. A lot of donkeys have white around the eyes, and I think it gives them such personality. Some of this gets covered with white markings later, but it adds a level of realism where the base coat shows through. I gave her a final layer of warm brown pastel, which looks far brighter in my studio lighting than it actually is, and sealed all my work here in preparation to move on to the white markings. I decided to paint her white markings without a reference, as I find my work turns out more organic that way. I had a few images in mind from Pinterest of some pinto patterns and drew off what I remembered of those while I freehanded the markings. I have sped up some of the footage of painting her markings because it's a long process and the video would be very long if I didn't, but I left some unedited to show my normal working pace as well. that is one half of her white markings done, and I'll probably go over them another couple of times to really make them opaque, but I won't do that on camera because it's just repetitive. So now I'm going to move on to this side. Right, I have finished making all of her whites solid. I'm very happy with how they've come out. So now I'm going to move on to refining her details using some pastels. I'm going to be using a paper blending stick for this. This is meant for smudging pencil in pencil drawings, but I find it's quite handy for applying very small details in pastels. This paper blending stick is the tool I use for several things, including Appaloosa spots and applying dark rims around eyes on models, as you can see me doing here. It gives a softer edge than paint and ultimately comes across to the naked eye as more realistic. I also use it to put down a colour guide in the mane for the paint later, and to add a little gradient to her tail. I applied a dusting of pink pastel to her nose, and then using a tiny detailing brush, I used dark orange to blush the inside of her nostrils and the corners of her mouth for some depth and realism. I'm going to be using burnt umber acrylic for the base of her eyes, which I will then be refining with black and possibly a paler brown depending on what shade of brown I want her eyes to be. I used grey acrylic as a base coat for her hooves. Putting down a solid base colour on hooves is very satisfying. I usually leave the bottoms of the hooves until last on a custom because otherwise they get covered in pastel dust again from being stood on my workbench. I used burnt umber again for the dark areas of her mane. You can see here I accidentally got some on her eyebrow when painting her eye, but that was easily covered with white acrylic. then used the same burnt umber to create a dorsal stripe cutting through her white markings down her spine. A lot of donkeys have dorsal stripes, it's quite characteristic of the breed and also common in dun coats, so of course she had to have one. I gave her hooves a top coat of deep brown, which I felt suited her warm coat better than the cooler grey, and finished her eyes with black pupils, which gave her a distinctively mischievous expression. Her new owner named her Popcorn, and I couldn't have chosen a more fitting name myself. Thank you for spending some of your time here today. If you enjoyed the video, do leave a like, as it really helps my channel grow, and consider subscribing for more model horse customizing content. If you'd like to see regular updates on my customs and projects, head over to my Instagram, the link is in my channel description. Happy painting, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!